Hey everybody, this is the Proletarian Revolution against the Bureaucracy. Originally published in December 1956, and of course it's by Cornelius Castoriadis. This is from the second volume of Political and Social Writings of Castoriadis, from, I guess, his Socialisme ou Barbarie years. Yeah. Trying to work my way through all three volumes. I think I'm about a little less than halfway through all three. I've done the first, and I'm done about a third of the second. The movement of the Eastern European proletariat against the bureaucracy and its system of exploitation and oppression that is fraudulently presented as socialist is now bursting forth into broad daylight. For many long years it remained concealed in factories, expressing itself only through the workers' continuously renewed refusal to cooperate with their exploiters. It overflowed onto the streets of East Berlin in June 1953. It then took up arms in June 1956 at Poznan. It made the Russian masters tremble with rage and fear and eventually forced them to back down in October 1956 in Poland. It now has mounted an assault on the heavens themselves for the past 7 weeks in Hungary, where it is achieving unbelievable results. In the space of a few short days, it has pulverized the ruling class, its state, its party, and its ideology as no class, state, party, or ideology has been pulverized before. It struggled with its bare hands against the tanks and machine guns of the most powerful army the world has ever seen. On the day after its military, quote, defeat, end quote, it picks up still more strength, clarity, awareness, and organization than ever before. The Hungarian Revolution is the most advanced position in this combat. This means merely that it offers the clearest and the highest expression of the tendencies and goals of workers in our epoch. Its significance is utterly universal. Its underlying causes can be found in the countries dominated by the so-called communist bureaucracy, and in Western capitalist countries as well. Its lessons hold true for Russian, Czech, and Yugoslavian workers, just as tomorrow they hold true for Chinese workers. They hold equally well for French, British, and American workers. In CSPEL, CSEPEL factories in Budapest, I don't know how you'd say that, maybe it's CSPEL, factories in Budapest as well as in the Renault factories in Paris, workers suffer, in nearly the same forms and near to the same degree, the same exploitation, the same oppression. They are cheated out of the product of their labor, they are expropriated from the direction of their own activity, they are subjected to the domination of a stratum of despotic rulers decked out in, quote, democratic, end quote, or, quote, socialist, end quote, garb. Here as there, and whatever its form, the workers' struggle is therefore ultimately the same. Here as there, the workers aim and can only aim at the same goals: to abolish exploitation, to manage their own work, to create a new organization of society. Hungarian workers have pushed this struggle to its ultimate form. They have taken arms, they have set up councils, they have advanced the essential elements of a socialist program: limitation of hierarchy, abolition of work norms, workers' management in the factories, a leading role for the workers' councils in social life. Forced to cease armed combat in the face of the brutal intervention of Russian tanks, they have not for all that abandoned their struggle. For 5 weeks their general strike, their refusal to cooperate with Kadar, the incredible courage they display in support of their demands in defiance of Khrushchev's tanks and machine guns, and despite hunger, cold, and deportations, show to the stunned world the impotence of the oppressors and the inanity of their crimes before the immense force of a consciously aware proletariat. Even if it is temporarily vanquished, the Hungarian Revolution will have been a profound defeat for the exploiters, and its repercussions, which are only beginning to be felt, will have transformed the world in this second half of the 20th century. For the first time, a modern totalitarian regime has been smashed by a workers' uprising. For 10 years, this regime had done everything it could to exterminate all opposition. It had surrounded the country with a ring of police agents and informers. It claimed to have control over all of people's activities and even their souls. Suddenly, the scientifically organized system of totalitarian oppression flew to pieces before the determination and heroism of the practically unarmed Hungarian population. After 6 days of desperate struggle, the Russian divisions themselves had to recognize their defeat and cease firing on Sunday, October 28th. The crushing of the armed resistance after November 4th by the Second Russian Intervention, which required a week-long battle and 20 tank divisions, does not lessen the accuracy of this statement. It reinforces it. No mere, quote, police operation, end quote, could stamp out the Hungarian insurrection. Several Army Corps units had to engage in regular military operations for 6 days in order to defeat the civil population of a country of 10 million inhabitants. And, on the political plane, the, quote, victory, end quote, of Russian imperialism ended in an unprecedented defeat. To dominate a country is not the same as dominating its ruins, nor is it to bring on themselves forever the inexpiable hatred of the whole population, with the exception of a handful of traitors and sellouts. For the first time, the proletariat has fought head-on with the bureaucratic regime that dares to call itself, quote, working class, end quote, and that in reality represents the latest and most perfected form of an exploitative and oppressive system of rule. Almost the entire population of a country is rising up and battling an allegedly, quote, popular, end quote, regime. Through their struggle, the Hungarian workers have torn the, quote, communist, end quote, mask from the bureaucracy and made it appear to the eyes of humanity in its hideous nakedness. An exploiting stratum full of hatred and fear of the workers, now in a state of utter political and moral decomposition, incapable of relying upon anything but Russian tanks to ensure its domination and ready to massacre, quote, its, end quote, population, to reduce, quote, its, end quote, country to ruins with a foreign army in order to maintain itself in power. Not through theoretical discussions, but by the shots fired by armed insurrectionists, the Hungarian Revolution demolishes the most gigantic fraud in history, the presentation of the bureaucratic system of rule as, quote, socialist, a fraud in which the bourgeois and the Stalinist intellectuals of the, quote, right and of the, quote, left had collaborated because in the end they all profited by it. The usurpation of Marxism, of socialism, and of the flag of the proletarian revolution by the stratum of totalitarian exploiters who predominate in Russia and elsewhere appears here and now as an intolerable insult in the eyes of large masses of workers. It is becoming clear even to the least conscious of people that once in power, Stalinists represent the working class as much as the slave driver represents the galley slave. The Polish crisis and the Hungarian Revolution bring into broad daylight the terrible crisis of the bureaucratic system of rule and then intensify it 100-fold. They force the bureaucracy to open its account books and its secret police archives, if only part way. What emerges is not simply the image of the most inhuman form of exploitation and oppression, but also the image of unbelievable chaos throughout bureaucratic society. The terrifying anarchy of the supposedly, quote, planned, end quote, economy, and the bureaucracy's total inability to manage its own economy, its own system. Through their action, the Polish and Hungarian workers likewise have shown the extreme fragility of this regime. The Russian, quote, bloc, end quote, is no less made up of bits and pieces than the American, quote, bloc, end quote. The one, like the other, is incapable of organizing its domination over its satellites. The bureaucratic class is no more securely woven into the fabric of society than the bourgeois class. A few days of insurrection suffice to make its system of rule, its state apparatus, its party vanish. The Hungarian Revolution has reduced, quote, democratization, end quote, de-Stalinization, end quote, to nothing. It has shown that for the bureaucracy, as for every other exploiting class, it never could have been a question of concessions on essential questions. The true face of, quote, democratization, the ruins of Budapest, and the infamous lies of Radio Moscow show this to the workers of the world. Moreover, the Hungarian Revolution has shown that the bureaucracy, just like the bourgeoisie, finds itself incapable of having any coherent policy whatsoever, whether, quote, democratic, end quote, or not. It is logical for an exploiting class to kill people for a policy, but it is clear that purely and simply massacring people is not in itself a policy. Surely, massacring people expresses not only the absence of policy, but one's inability to have a policy. Just as French imperialism, with its back against the wall, is at one and the same time incapable of dominating North Africa by force and of abandoning it entirely, so the Russian bureaucracy is at one and the same time incapable of pulling out of Hungary and of remaining there, obliged to put an end to, quote, democratization, end quote, which was becoming transformed into revolution, incapable of reverting to the now unenforceable Stalinist system. It is thereby reduced to the spasmodic use of violence, which resolves nothing and immediately is turned back against it. Khrushchev, hysterical blunderer and drunken chatterer that he is the worthy incarnation in the present era of the bureaucracy, just as much as Stalin, perfidious, taciturn, narrow-minded, and cruel, was for the preceding era. Facing down this exploitative, corrupt, and rotten bureaucracy, which fear drives to the assassination of a whole people, stands the human figure of the Hungarian proletariat. Only 10 years was needed for it to gain experience of the new system of exploitation and to draw from this experience its own conclusions. Totalitarian terror and poverty have neither broken it nor demoralized it. They have, on the contrary, clarified its awareness and strengthened its determination. Without any preliminary organization, without anyone having to point out to them anything whatsoever, the Hungarian workers organized themselves into councils from the first days of the insurrection. Only a foreign army prevented them and prevents them still from seizing power. And while a handful of traitors try unsuccessfully to reconstitute a state apparatus, the councils are the sole form of social organization that still exists. Their strength is such that they were able to achieve this miracle that never before has been seen. A several week-long general strike after the military defeat of an insurrection. Their program equals and even surpasses that of every proletarian revolution up to this day. Limitation of hierarchy, workers' management of the factories, abolition of work norms. They put forward political demands which show that they are the sole political force in this society in ruins. And they insist upon having a leading political role. It is they who demand the retreat of the Russian troops, the right to publish their own newspapers, the constitution of workers' councils in all sectors of national life, and recognition by the government of their representative and political functions. Journalists and intellectuals of the right and left will see in all this a host of things: the incompetence of certain rulers, the struggle of various tendencies within the bureaucracy, chance, a trend towards, quote, national socialism, end quote, a crisis within the bureaucracy, chance, a trend toward, a crisis peculiar to the, Jesus Christ. Let me repeat that. Journalists and intellectuals of the right and left will see in all this a host of things: the incompetence of certain rulers, the struggle of various tendencies within the bureaucracy, chance, a trend toward, quote, national socialism, end quote, a crisis peculiar to the bureaucratic system of rule, new possibilities for reformism. They will see in it everything they want to see in it except the basic thing, the only thing that matters: the working classes' struggle against exploitation, the working classes' struggle for a new form of social organization. They will not see that behind these events in Eastern Europe, as well as behind all of history over the past century, there is a factor that shapes modern society and gives to it its characteristic traits: the development of the proletariat and its struggle for a classless society. Once we get to the bottom of things, we see that there is no crisis peculiar to the bureaucracy and its system of rule, bureaucratic capitalism. Of course, the more recent and less homogeneous bureaucracy of the satellite countries is not as solid as the Russian bureaucracy. The 20th Congress, however, And if you don't know, the 20th Congress is where Khrushchev gave his secret speech denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and the various crimes of the era of the terror. Anyway, the 20th Congress, however, is there to bear witness that the latter is going through the same crisis within its own country, though with a different timing, and this crisis itself renders vain all the efforts the ruling class in the West have undertaken to stabilize their system of rule and to manage their society. This is the case of French capitalism's inability to rationalize the management of the country or to settle its relations with its former colonies. It is also the cause of English and American capitalism's inability to discipline their workers and to dominate their satellites. Bureaucratic capitalism in Russia and in Eastern Europe simply applies to the whole of the economy and of society the methods that private capitalism had created for and applied to the management of each individual factory. These methods, which are based on the domination of a stratum of managers over the mass of producers, are less and less capable of permitting even a moderately rational and harmonious functioning of social life. In the East as in the West, regimes have to cope with the problem dominating our epoch. From now on, no particular class exists on the scale needed to run society. Life in the modern world, which is made up of the intertwined and constantly changing activities of hundreds of millions of conscious producers, escapes the grasp of every ruling stratum that raises itself above society. Either this world will plunge deeper and deeper into chaos, or it will be reorganized from top to bottom by the producing masses, thus making a tabula rasa of all established institutions and instaurating new institutions, which will permit the free development of the creative capacities of millions of individuals who alone can deal with the problems created by life in modern societies. This reorganization cannot begin in any other way than by workers' management of production, the total and direct power of the producers organized in their councils over the economy and over all of social life. For years, we have worked unceasingly to show, as other revolutionary groups have done in other countries, that in no way was bureaucratic capitalism resolving the contradictions of contemporary society, that just as much as the bourgeoisie, the bureaucracy itself was digging its own grave. The proletarians of the countries dominated by this bureaucracy could neither be mystified by an imaginary, quote, socialism, end quote, nor reduce the state of impotent slaves, that on the contrary, let me repeat that whole sentence. I'm not repeating the whole sentence, that's really long. That the proletarians of the countries dominated by this bureaucracy could neither be mystified by an imaginary, quote, socialism, end quote, nor reduced to the state of impotent slaves, that, on the contrary, having experienced the most perfected, the most concentrated form of capitalism and exploitation, they were becoming ripe for a revolution surpassing in its clarity and its determination all previous revolutions. Today, the proletariat of Eastern Europe is in the vanguard of the world revolution. We have worked unceasingly to show that the clear, definitive, and irrefutable conclusion to be drawn from the experience of the Russian Revolution was that a party separate and distinct from the working class could not be the instrument for the dictatorship of the proletariat. That the latter was the power of the masses' Soviet organs, but also and especially that the dictatorship of the proletariat had no meaning if it was not straightaway and at the same time workers' management of production. Today, the Hungarian working class spontaneously makes its program the adoption of workers' management and demands that the leading role in all domains of national life be granted to the workers' councils. The Hungarian Revolution is bringing these ideas to the common awareness of workers in all countries. Through this revolution, through its heroic example, whatever may be its subsequent fate, it overturns existing political classifications. It creates a new line of demarcation both within the workers' movement as well as within society at large. It creates a new historical era. A host of problems are emptied of their content. A host of debates become purely and simply pointless. The time for subtleties and subterfuges has passed. For years to come, all questions that count can be summed up as follows. Are you for or against the action and the program of the Hungarian workers? Are you or for you against the constitution of workers' councils in all sectors of national life and workers' management of production? The bureaucratic economy and the exploitation of the proletariat. Bureaucratic, quote, planning, end quote. Until now, Stalinist propaganda, aided by the subtle, quote, objective, end quote, advocates of the bureaucracy, of which Charles Bettelheim is the typical representative in France, had succeeded in persuading the public that, quote, planning, end quote, as it is practiced in Russia and in its satellite countries, represented a mode of directing the economy that was at once new and better, as well as infinitely more effective than the blind guidance of the economy achieved by the capitalist market. This is just a myth. Bureaucratic planning is nothing but the extension to the economy as a whole of the methods created and applied by capitalism in the, quote, rational, end quote, direction of large production units. If we consider the most profound feature of the economy, the concrete situation in which people are placed, we see that bureaucratic planning is the most highly perfected realization of the spirit of capitalism. It pushes to the limit its most significant tendencies. Just as in the management of a large capitalist production unit, this type of planning is carried out by a separate stratum of managers, made up of bureaucrats from the economy, the state, and the party. Its essence, like that of capitalist production, lies in an effort to reduce the direct producers to the role of pure and simple executants of received orders formulated by a particular stratum that pursues its own interests. This stratum cannot run things well, just as the management apparatus at Renault or Ford factories cannot run things well. The myth of capitalism's productive efficacy at the level of the individual factory, a myth shared by bourgeois and Stalinist ideologues alike, cannot stand up to the most elementary examination of the facts, and any industrial worker could draw up a devastating indictment against capitalist, quote, rationalization, end quote, judged on its own terms. First of all, the managerial bureaucracy does not know what it is supposed to be managing. The reality of production escapes the managerial bureaucracy. For this reality is nothing but the activity of the producers, and the producers do not inform the managers, whether they are private capitalists or bureaucrats, about what really is taking place. Quite often they organize themselves in such a way that the managers won't be informed, in order to avoid increased exploitation because they feel antagonistic, or quite simply because they have no interest. It isn't their business. In the second place, the there is in italicized. In the second place, the way in which production is organized is set up entirely against the workers. They always are being asked, one way or another, to do more work without getting paid for it. Management's orders, therefore, inevitably, management's orders, therefore, inevitably meet with fierce resistance on the part of those who have to carry them out. In this way, the managerial apparatus, whether it is in France or in Poland, in America or in Russia, spends most of its time not in organizing production, but in organizing constraints, either direct or indirect ones. In the third place, as much if not more than that of a private capitalist factory, the bureaucracy's managerial apparatus is rent by internal conflicts. The various professional, quote, categories, end quote, of bureaucrats upon whom are superimposed, quote, political, end quote, coteries, and even clans and cliques, properly speaking, escape from one another's clutches, deceive each other, reciprocally disclaim responsibilities, and so on. And struggles among such clans and cliques are a basic sociological given in a regime organized along the lines of a, quote, civil service, end quote. All this makes bureaucratic, quote, planning, end quote, a mishmash of rationality and absurdity, with about the same degree of wastefulness as that of the traditional capitalist economy. For the wastefulness that arises in every capitalist factory due to the radical scission between the class of directors and the class of executants, and to an irreconcilable opposition of the interests and attitudes of these two classes, exists just as much in the bureaucratically run factory. And the extension of this mode of control to the economy as a whole, where problems are much more difficult to resolve since they are much more complex, ensures that the, quote, planned, end quote, economy will exhibit the same degree of anarchy as can be observed in the private capitalist economy, though under different forms. Bureaucratic planning is as chaotic as the capitalist market is. Of course, the Stalinists and their apologists have been talking for some time now about certain, quote, errors, end quote, in the planning process. It is not a question of, quote, errors, end quote. It is a question of a certain type of anarchy that is organically inherent in bureaucratic type planning. It is almost as if they were trying to make us believe that somewhere in the planning offices a calculator made an error in multiplication. In reality, it is a matter of a fundamental social and historical phenomenon. The bureaucracy is just as incapable of rationally directing the economy as private capitalism is incapable of doing so. Until now, it has been extremely difficult to provide precise empirical proof for this statement due to the fact that the bureaucracy was systematically hiding economic data about its system. Of late, it has begun to publish some statistics. Let us note in passing that, as a matter of fact, this change in attitude expresses precisely this crisis we have been talking about. Khrushchev and other speakers at the Russian Party's 20th Congress have acknowledged in veiled terms that the bureaucracy's mendacity has turned against it, since it was becoming impossible for the bureaucracy to know even the official truth about its own economy. Of course, the bureaucracy can cure one of its ills only by creating for itself another. The publication of statistics, even cooked statistics, cannot fail to provoke discussion and ferment in intellectual circles, which are not all, to say the least, wholly owned by the regime. At the level of the economy as a whole, the wastefulness of bureaucratic planning is revealed first by the lack of commensurability, of a rational connection on the technical level between the development of the various sectors of production. Workers are exploited in order to build new factories, but these factories do not function at all. These factories function well below their productive capacity because the sectors that ought to provide them with raw materials or utilize their products have not been developed accordingly. This, according to the accompanying official figures, production as envisaged in the Czechoslovakian plan for 1956 ought to remain far below the productive capacity available in the country's principal sectors. There's a There's this chart here, and I'm not going to read the chart. Basically, how do I show this? Basically has a list of industries or like products that are produced by the economy. So they have coal, brown coal, iron ore, rolled products, cement, sulfuric acid, nitrogenous fertilizers, phosphorus fertilizers, and next to all those things, they have what the plan says and the actual productive capacity. And in almost every single, every single one of them, there's productive capacity, and there's a gulf. The productive capacity is oftentimes a good deal higher than what is actually produced by the plan. I don't know, I'm not explaining it well, but okay. The Czechoslovakian workers have starved for 10 years in order to build factories that operate at half capacity. What happens any differently under private capitalism? In fact, percentages of utilization of available capacity as low as those found here, 60, 50, and even 40%, do not appear in the private capitalist economy except in years of very severe depression. This is not a situation peculiar to Czechoslovakia. In Hungary, quote, capacity is not fully utilized, end quote. The Economic Commission for Europe, ECE, said in August in the engineering industries as well as in the textile and food processing industries, and this while the population is underfed to a well-known degree. In Russia, quote, the directives of the 5-year plan reveal that sizable capacity reserves exist in the chemical engineering and food processing industries, end quote. As for Poland, the description given by Oskar Lange, official government economist, is absolutely catastrophic. Quote, along with these revolutionary social and economic changes, bracket, he is talking about the creation of heavy industry and the, quote, nationalization, end quote, of the means of production, end bracket, note by the author. However, serious disproportions have arisen which hinder further development of the national economy. These disproportions are generally known. Disproportion between the development of agriculture and industry, disproportion between the productive capacity of industry and its raw material supplies, disproportion between the quantitative increase of production and the quality of products, as well as production costs, and disproportion between investment and production programs on the one hand, and on the other, the obsolete techniques which still prevail in many of our enterprises. These disproportions are reflected in the great difficulties of our foreign trade, in the shortage of raw materials which leads to interruptions in production and to incomplete utilization of existing industrial capacity, in the wastage of equipment and raw materials, and in the deficient and irregular supply of goods and services to the population, end quote. We must have a full understanding of what these data signify. The bureaucracy masks the failure of planning first of all by lying flat out. By publishing false data, no one was able till now, and in most cases, that quote was Oskar Lange. We must have a full understanding of what these data signify. The bureaucracy masks the failure of planning first of all by lying flat out. By publishing false data, no one was able till now, and in most cases no one yet is able, to verify whether, quote, the plan was carried out 101%, end quote. Yet there is even more. The plan can be carried out 101% or 99% in relation to its own objectives. But what is the relation of these objectives to the economy's real potentialities? It is on this feature of the Eastern European economy, which no longer is concerned with the ratio of one set of figures on paper to another set of figures on paper, that the data furnished earlier cast their harsh light. If the 1956 Czechoslovak phosphorus fertilizer production plan is achieved at 100%, this means that 50% of this sector's productive capacity, see the figures in the preceding table, has been wasted, while agriculture has a pressing need for fertilizer. The ECE study previously cited, we can find several other examples of underutilization of productive capacity. That is to say, idled machinery. Lange says of Poland that, quote, the present limited utilization, bracket, of the, quote, existing productive capacity of industry, end quote, end bracket, author, is considered wasteful by the working class and by society as a whole, end quote. But what is astonishing to discover is that the idled machinery goes along hand in hand with idled people. Lange states that in Poland, quote, Some serious signs of unemployment are becoming apparent, end quote. The ECE is more explicit. In Poland, Hungary, and Romania, it says the, quote, manufacturing industry can in general recruit as many workers as it needs, end quote. In Poland, quote, 300,000 persons, or 4.5% of those employed in the socialist sector, were without work in June, and both in Poland and in Hungary, the absorption of school leavers into the labor force is proving slower than usual. In Budapest, for example, 1/3 of the 14,000 or 15,000 young persons in the 14 to 15-year age group did not at once find work, and difficulties are expected with employment of those of the 16 to 18-year age group who so far have had only seasonal employment on the land, end quote. Working class resistance, ultimate cause of the failure of the, quote, plan, end quote. In almost all the bureaucratic countries, Russia, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, even Poland, one of the gravest expressions of this disproportionality till now has been the utterly inadequate levels of development of energy production. In some cases, this was the result of, quote, poor planning, end quote. In Russia, for example, oil refinery output during the first half of 1956 had not attained the levels set by the plan on account of transportation difficulties and lack of storage space. This means that after 30 years of practice with, quote, planning, end quote, the Russian bureaucracy still is capable of building refineries without having resolved at the same time the problems of transporting oil to these refineries and of storing it. Who does not see that such, quote, mistakes, end quote, are not accidental, but rather are the intrinsic result of the bureaucratic mode of planning? The fundamental cause of this energy shortage, however, lies in the crisis of coal production. This crisis expresses the same conflict between miners and production managers that prevails equally in France, in England, or in Germany, and which also prevents these countries from developing their production of coal despite their overriding need to do so. Work conditions in the mines of Eastern Europe are the same as those in Western capitalist countries, so that although the wages paid to miners are higher than those of other branches of industry, the workers leave the mines as soon as they can, just like in Western countries. In Russia, the Donetsk coal mines did not reach their planned targets in the first half year of 1956 on account of a manpower shortage. In Czechoslovakia, miner absenteeism was 9% in 1937, i.e., a miner did not report to his shift 9 days out of every 100. It was 18% in the first half of 1956. Quote, the manpower situation in the Czechoslovak coal mines is in fact regarded as so serious that the government has recently imposed a formal ban on movement of workers out of the industry. A step, bracket, that is all, end bracket, the more striking at a time when in the Soviet Union and other Eastern European countries the trend is toward a greater freedom of choice of employment, end quote. In Poland, the largest coal producer among the satellite countries and one of the main producers in Europe, where production is hardly growing at all, plus 3% from 1954 to 1955, plus 2% between the first 6 months of 1955 and the first 6 months of 1956. The coal export program had to be reduced from 24.3 million tons in 1955 to 21 million in 1956. With Polish coal exports directed mainly toward other satellite countries, the ECE estimates that, quote, the repercussions of this cut on other Eastern European countries will inevitably be serious, end quote. According to the ECE, the Polish coal mining crisis results in particular from manpower shortages, and we will come back to the causes of this shortage, but it results also from lower yield. Gomulka, in a section of his speech before the Polish Party's Central Committee, states that the daily yield of an underground crew in the Polish mines has shrunk 7.7% between 1949 and 1955. In all the capitalist countries, yield increased during this period. From the same section of this speech, we find out that using good old capitalist methods, the main part of the increase in Polish coal production comes from miners working overtime. Absenteeism, desertion from the mines, drops in yield hitherto unknown in the annals of modern industry. What does all this mean except the exploited miners' bitter refusal to cooperate in the production process? What is the bureaucracy's response to this situation? Gomulka describes it in the following terms. We have set up Sunday labor as a rule which can, in the following terms, quote, we have set up Sunday labor as a rule which can only ruin the miner's health and strength and make it impossible to maintain mining equipment adequately. We have imposed on many of our miners military or prison labor, end quote. How can the bureaucracy not see that this response, this, quote, solution, end quote, given to the problem created by the overexploited miners' refusal to accept its system, only worsens tenfold the crisis that existed at the start? It is because it shares the outlook and mentality of all exploiting classes. The worker has to be made to work, and it is right. For under its system, as in every system based upon exploitation, there is only one method, one logic. The logic by which the managers put pressure on the producer, either direct physical pressure or indirect economic pressure. We see in these examples both the bureaucracy's quote, we see in these examples both what the bureaucracy's quote planning end quote amounts to and what the deepest roots of its failure are. Its own system, lying, terror, lack of supervision, systematically inflated results, fear of seeming to, quote, criticize and, quote, higher-ups by pointing out that their directives cannot be achieved, inevitably condemns the bureaucracy to poor planning, to planning in an inherently erroneous fashion. But there is much more. The bureaucracy takes it for granted that the workers will produce what they are told to produce according to norms set from above, which are constantly accelerated. The bureaucracy decides on paper that the miners will produce so many percentage points more. Its representatives and its slave drivers in the mines are charged with the task of forcing the miners to do so. And somehow or other, on this hypothesis, it constructs its, quote, plan, end quote. Coal will go to such and such foundries or steel works, which will produce so much steel, which will be used by rolling mills to manufacture so much sheet metal, etc. But the miners are leaving the mines, and those who stay on are putting out less and less. Coal is not being produced, and the entire plan never gets off the ground. As a whole, the plan allows, of course, for a certain degree of elasticity. Several sectors have flexible production schedules with wide margins built in. Substitutes can be used, stocks can be depleted or added to, etc. Nevertheless, it is difficult for the bureaucracy to make intelligent use of this flexibility for the same reason that made intelligent planning possible. But in any case, when workers' resistance to production in basic sectors is added to already inherently poor planning, no amount of elasticity in the world can reabsorb the resulting perturbations. Disturbances spread in a cumulative fashion from sector to sector, and from then on, there is nothing surprising about the entire productive apparatus functioning at only 70, 60, or 50% of its capacity. The crisis in productivity. Quote, nationalization, end quote, and, quote, planning, end quote, have changed nothing about the worker's real situation in the production process. The worker has remained a simple executant who is not simply denied all initiative by the bureaucratic methods of directing production, but is transformed by these methods into a pure and simple appendage of the machinery. Quote, military or prison labor, end quote, Gomulka says when speaking of Polish miners. But according to Lange, this situation exists throughout all of Polish industry. Quote, "We ran the economy by methods which are characteristic of a, quote, war economy," end quote, i.e. by moral and political appeals, by laws, decrees, and administrative regulations. In other words, by methods involving various kinds of extra economic compulsion rather than economic incentives, end quote. Whence results the workers' resistance to production and to the execution of the economic plans, which rightly are resented as exploitation, pure and simple. This resistance has repercussions on economic productivity in several ways and culminates in a terrible crisis of disorganization. 1. Resistance to exploitation expresses itself in a drop in productivity as well as in exertion on the worker's part. In the simplest meaning of the word, quote, exertion, end quote, bracket, effort, end bracket. Here, for example, is the basic cause of the drop in mining yield noted by Gomulka. 2. At the same time, it is expressed in the disappearance of the minimum collective and spontaneous management and organization of work that the workers normally and of necessity put out. No modern factory could function for 24 hours without this spontaneous organization of work that groups of workers, independent of the official business management, carry out by filling in the gaps of official production directives, by preparing for the unforeseen and for regular breakdowns of equipment, by compensating for management's mistakes, etc. Under, quote, normal, end quote, conditions of exploitation, workers are torn between the need to organize themselves in this way in order to carry out their work, otherwise there are repercussions for them, and their natural desire to do their work on the one hand, and on the other, the awareness that by doing so they only are serving the boss's interests. Added to these conflicting concerns are the continual efforts of the factory's management apparatus to, quote, direct, end quote, all aspects of the workers' activity, which often results only in preventing them from organizing themselves. It was left to bureaucratic, quote, socialism, end quote, to achieve what capitalism could never do, to kill the workers' creativity completely, to abolish almost entirely their spontaneous tendency to organize those aspects of their activity that no one but they could ever organize. Here is what Lange has to say about it. For some years, quote, "For some years now, we have witnessed increasing indifference as regards attitude towards work, both in the administration and in the distribution of goods and supplies of services. This indifference paralyzes our daily life. Lately, it has also begun to penetrate the working class, which, being the socially and politically most conscious part of our society, offered the greatest resistance to this attitude. The nihilistic attitude of a great part of the workers is a result of both their bad living conditions and their lack of confidence that an economic policy which demands such great sacrifices from them is really appropriate and justified," end quote. 3. Resistance to exploitation leads to a qualitative drop in productivity. The psychological attitude due to these objective material difficulties is accelerating the process of dislocation in the national economy. In industry, production of substandard or unusable goods, rejects, and wastage of materials constitute a serious economic problem. At the beginning, it appeared mainly in the field of consumer goods. The diminishing quality of consumer goods became a serious matter, hampering the improvement of living conditions. But it did not slow down the production process. At present, the production of unusable goods, rejects, has extended to the engineering industries, manufacture of tools, and transportation equipment, etc. This threatens to interrupt the technical process of production and to disrupt the whole basis of the national economy. Sorry, I think that was a quote, but it didn't really acknowledge itself as a quote. I don't know. I'm going to assume that last bit was Oscar Lange. Yeah. Because that's who he's talking about right now, at least. 4. The combined result of all the preceding is the collapse of the bureaucratic plan and the crisis of productivity in terms of the overall yield of the economic apparatus. There are, quote, interruptions in production and incomplete utilization of existing industrial capacity, wastage of equipment and raw materials, and deficient and irregular supply of goods and services to the population, end quote, as noted by Lange in a passage cited earlier. Until now, we have considered only the bureaucracy's inability to plan rationally, insofar as it results from the workers' resistance to exploitation. Indeed, it is in this resistance that the fundamental cause of the failure of every plan of all management imposed from outside the producers is to be found, but other causes which pertain to the very nature of the bureaucracy may be added to this one. We will mention only 2 of them. First of all, planning is impossible without precise, readily available information. In particular, information is required on the results of production as the production process is occurring. Now, in a bureaucratic system, the position of individual bureaucrats or groups of bureaucrats occupying a given place in the productive apparatus depends on the results that, quote, they, end quote, have obtained in reality or in appearance. And unless an infinitely regressive system of supervision is set up, the central bureaucracy most often is obliged to be content with apparent results. At the very most, it can supervise the quantity but not the quality of production. Hence the unavoidable tendency of bureaucrats who direct factories or particular sectors of the economy to inflate the results they have obtained. Thus the central planners rely for large part on imaginary data. Here is what Lange says about it, quote, "We must stop the race for purely quantitative indices which are obtained thanks to low quality and high costs. The results are purely fictitious, raw materials and human labor being used for the production of goods which do not achieve the intended economic effect, nor quite often even the intended technical effect, e.g. agricultural machines unfit for use after a few weeks." End quote. Lange. Second, the bureaucratic system being a, quote, civil service, end quote, type system, the problem of nominating individuals to various posts and of promoting them becomes a fundamental one. Now, the bureaucracy has at its disposal no, quote, objective, end quote, method for resolving this problem. On the other hand, a large part of the activity of bureaucrats as individuals involves their trying by any and every means to resolve their own personnel problem. In this way, the operation of cliques and clans takes on a fundamental sociological and economic significance. It radically undermines the entire, quote, personnel policy, end quote, of the national economy from the top to the bottom, and therefore it undermines the national economy itself. In the article previously cited, Lange states that personnel policy in Poland is, quote, generally unrelated to the efficiency of any given worker, end quote. That it is founded on a, quote, bureaucratic judgment based on various inquiries and on the workers' connections with certain cliques, end quote. And that it ends up replacing, quote, experienced specialists, end quote, with, quote, people without technical qualifications and of doubtful political background and moral standards, end quote. Noting that, quote, there has been a general lowering of technical standards in various branches of the national economy, end quote, Lange calls for the elimination of, quote, favoritism, end quote. Those who have even the least experience with the workings of a big capitalist enterprise know that the bureaucratic apparatus running it suffers from exactly the same vices with respect to both the quote, information end quote, problem and quote, personnel policy. The situation in the Russian factories. As we have seen, the bureaucracy's official spokespeople have recognized the workers' resistance to exploitation in the satellite countries, as well as the resulting failure of bureaucratic planning. In Russia's case, we do not have comparable documents at our disposal, but a careful analysis of the report given at the CPSU's 20th Congress leads to similar conclusions. While it is patting itself on the back for the quote, enthusiasm end quote, and the quote, heroic labor end quote, of its workers, the Russian bureaucracy repeatedly insists through its designated representatives that it is absolutely necessary to make individual workers materially interested in the results of production, to tie their wages to the quote, quality and quantity end quote, of labor they furnish, etc. It thus exposes itself to the most glaring of contradictions, for if the workers were so, quote, enthusiastic, end quote, about producing, the bureaucracy would not have to be so hell-bent on the need for piece-rate wages. This proves that the worker in Russia, as in Western countries, is completely hostile to production increases, for he sees in the production increases increased exploitation. It also provides that the only way to get him interested in producing more is the lure of a bonus. But at the same time, the bureaucracy is obliged to admit that the system of individual bonuses is being constantly pushed aside without the pressure of the workers. Thus, Khrushchev complains that, quote, there is still a greater deal of disorganization and muddle in the system of wages and rate setting. There are frequent instances of wage leveling. It is necessary to put into effect consistently the principle of personal material incentives for workers. It is necessary to make wages directly dependent on the amount and quality of work done by each worker, and make full use of the mighty lever of material incentives for raising labor productivity, end quote. He criticizes certain, quote, utopian views, end quote, upon whose basis, quote, a negligent attitude to the socialist principle of material incentives began to take root, end quote. That's Khrushchev. Bulganin says, quote, Bulganin, I don't know if that's, I think that's how you pronounce his name, Bulganin, says oddly, quote, the present practice is to make output quotas correspond in effect to a definite wage level, and not to the technical and efficiency levels already achieved, end quote. Kaganovich explains, quote, the fundamental defect in the organization of wages is obsolescence of the wage scale. In the majority of industries, the base pay scale, the foundation of wage payments, has become particularly outdated. The average earnings of workers and employees in industry more than doubled from 1940 to 1955. But during this time, the wage scale remained almost unchanged. As a result, a large gap has appeared between the increased actual earnings of workers and the wage scale rates. In order to arrive at the actual level of earnings, work quotas are kept low. The wage scales and work quotas thus are no longer completely the organizing basis in matters of raising labor productivity and earnings, since almost half the earnings come from overfulfillment of quotas, from bonuses and other additional payments, owing to various overlays accumulated in the past 20 years. The wage scale contains elements of leveling. The gap between low wage rates and actual earnings is one of the reasons why the situation is unsatisfactory in the setting of work quotas. End quote. Kaganovich. Finally, Schwernik says, quote, "It is necessary to be more resolute in introducing technically sound output norms to avoid setting norms based upon the spirit of camaraderie and to revise them in accordance with changes in technology, organization of production, as well as in accordance with conditions of work, ensuring an increase in labor productivity," end quote. Schwernik. Neither Taylor nor any capitalist employer would have the least problem signing his name to these statements. We discover here not only that the Russian bureaucracy cannot rely upon the workers being, quote, enthusiastic, end quote, about producing, any more than French, English, or American capitalism can, nor only that the sole means it has at its disposal are bonuses for extra output. At the same time, we see that, just as in the traditional capitalist factory, these bonuses are one gigantic fraud. First, the workers are told, if you surpass the norm by 20%, your salary will be 20% higher. Once the norm is surpassed, they are told, under the pretext that the machinery has been modified, or without any pretext at all, it has been proved that everyone can work at 120%, therefore it is, quote, technically justified, end quote, for the norm to be raised henceforth to 120%. Of course, those who work at 20% above the new norm will be paid accordingly. This is exactly what Kaganovich and Schwernik are saying here, and the arguments about, quote, improvements in machinery, end quote, are no more valid in this case than when they are advanced by capitalists. For it is still the workers who produce this machinery, and it is the workers who have paid for it with the non-remunerated part of their labor. If, therefore, it improves output, it is only the workers who should profit from it. But there is much more. The bureaucracy claims to be running the economy, and in particular, to be setting wages by means of base rates and bonuses for extra output. In effect, these quotations make us realize that it succeeds in running things only in small part. For 25 years, it has been proclaiming that wages ought to be geared to individual output. It invents Stakhanovism. It creates, quote, labor heroes, end quote, etc. And what do we see? That the pressure of the workers in the enterprises is such that, quote, the present practice is to make output quotas correspond in effect to definite wage levels, and not to the technical and efficiency levels already achieved, end quote. Quote, the wage scales and work quotas thus are no longer completely the organizing basis in matters of raising labor productivity and earnings, end quote. Kaganovich says. He might just as well have said, quote, for the past 25 years, we just have been flapping in the wind as far as the organization of labor and wages is concerned, end quote. How can, quote, planning, end quote, based on a given rate of wages and given production norms operate if this rate and these norms, quote, no longer are the basic organizing principle, end quote? Which Schwernik politely calls, quote, setting norms based upon the spirit of camaraderie, end quote, clearly means the following. Neither production bonuses nor Stakhanovism, neither the GPU nor concentration camps provide the Russian factory director with the means to discipline workers and to impose on them a set of norms and pay rates. He is obliged to come to terms with them. And it is obvious why. The workers need only quietly and systematically sabotage production for the enterprise to fail to carry out its, quote, plan, end quote, and for the director to lose his head or his job. The director, therefore, has to make concessions, and consequently he screws with the, quote, plan, end quote. What, quote, planning, end quote, is worth under such conditions, from the strictly technical point of view we mean, is only too easy to comprehend. Another fundamental feature in the workers' struggle is to be found in this standardization Khrushchev is complaining about. Those, quote, elements of leveling, end quote, that make Kaganovich so unhappy. This clearly means not only that the factory director often is unsuccessful in controlling the enterprise's total wage bill, i.e. the workers insist on a given overall amount of pay, a given work pace which the director then, quote, justifies, end quote, to his higher-ups by inventing work norms corresponding to them, but also that he no longer succeeds in determining how wages will be distributed within the enterprise. Evidently, the workers are successful in getting norms set in such a fashion that everyone in the production process, bureaucrats' salaries are another matter, gets nearly the same wage for a, quote, honest, end quote, amount of work. Thus we find that in the Russian factory, the workers' struggle against wage differentiations goes as far, if not further, than it does in the French or American factory. We know how important protests against hierarchy have become in Poland and in the Hungarian Revolution. Stagnation of workers' living standards and the income of bureaucrats. Year after year, the bureaucracy's official statistics announce large increases in the population's standard of living. A favorite theme of Stalinist propaganda in France and elsewhere is that in Russia and in the, quote, popular democracies, end quote, living standards are rising rapidly while they might be stagnating or even declining in capitalist countries. In fact, the rapid development of living standards, rapid by comparison to previous periods of economic history, is a general phenomenon of modern economies, in particular of developed industrial countries. Statistics amply demonstrate this fact, and it can be verified in everyone's individual experience, too. The difference in this respect between private capitalist countries and the bureaucratic capitalist countries, if it is real, can be only a difference of degree. But even as such, its existence is dubious. For 1955, the official figures concerning the, quote, volume of retail sales in state stores and cooperatives, end quote, show the following amount of growth over 1954. Russia, 5%, Czechoslovakia, 11%, East Germany, 6%, Bulgaria, 12%, Hungary, 5%, Poland, 11%, Romania, 5%. Insofar as these figures leave aside, quote, sales on the open market, end quote, which basically involves a part of the food products sector and should increase less rapidly as the standard of living rises, they rather overestimate the increase in total consumption. Whatever is the case, we need only compare them to the percentage increases in private consumption in Western countries to discover that there is nothing exceptional about them. According to the Statistical Bulletin of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development of September-October 1956, private consumption during the same period increased 10% in Austria, 1% in Belgium, 7.5% in France, 11% in West Germany, 4% in Italy, 7.5% in the Netherlands, 3% in Sweden and in the United Kingdom, 7% in Canada, 7.5% in the United States. A thorough comparison would have to cover several years and take into account various other factors, but the basic similarity of situations is beyond doubt. In the second place, the overall percentage increases in consumption published by Eastern countries mask, just as those published by capitalist countries do, the fact that the rise in certain categories of income, more precisely the incomes of privileged groups, might be more rapid than that of working class wages. We will return to the significance of income differentiation in bureaucratic countries. Here we need only recall that an overall increase in, quote, consumption, end quote, of 5% can signify an increase of 0% for workers and 20% for bureaucrats. But the most important thing is that the figures published by the bureaucracy are for the most part false. They often are false in part in capitalist countries, notably because the price indexes used are not representative or even deliberately manipulated. This is what is happening at the moment in France. But they are practically never false to the degree that they are in the case of Eastern European countries. We needed the Polish crisis to make us aware of the extent of these falsifications. According to Gomulka, the 27% increase in real wages in Poland during the period of the 6-year plan, 1949 to 55, was, quote, a mere juggling of figures which deceived no one and only irritated people more, end quote. This signifies that the 11% increase in 1955 indicated earlier here for this country is in large part or totally imaginary. Here indeed is what the Economic Commission for Europe said about it 6 months before Gomulka. Quote, during the 6 years 1949 to 1955, average money wages in Poland increased by 130%, and the official retail price index 80%. The increase of 28% in net, i.e. real, i.e. real, end bracket, wages implied by the comparison of these two figures is, however, certainly too high. A rough calculation of the increase in the cost of purchasing the fixed basket of goods and services covered by the cost of living index, which was in use in 1949, gives a percentage increase of 130%, i.e. about equal to the rise in the average real wages. But this too may be wide of the truth, if only because of the not very satisfactory nature of the basket. Nevertheless, the conclusion can hardly be avoided that real wages in the less favored branches of the economy appear to have fallen not only relatively but absolutely, end quote. Economic Bulletin, May 1956. In other words, on the basis of the price index used in 1949, which already was, quote, not very satisfactory, end quote, the increase in real wages over 6 years in Poland was nil. And more cleverly than a French politician like Ramadier, Ramadier, the Polish bureaucracy has cooked up a fake index in order to persuade people that they were living better. On the other hand, the standard of living is deteriorating as a function of a factor that cannot be represented in statistics. The crisis in productivity is expressed in the lowered quality of goods. Lang suggests that, quote, the diminishing quality of consumer goods became a serious matter hampering the improvement of living conditions, end quote. Quoting Zabad-Nepp, June 19, 1956, the Economic Commission for Europe wrote, quote, the problem of choice and of quality, Czechoslovakia perhaps excepted, is still of extreme importance to the consumer in spite of recent improvements. In Hungary, over the past 6 years, quote, the quality of a number of consumer goods has deteriorated owing to an exaggerated drive for quantitative results. As in these circumstances, the new purchases become frequently necessary because of the lower quality of commodities. Real wages were accordingly reduced, end quote. Compared with the workers' situation, consumption in the privileged bureaucratic strata has developed unrestrainedly. We cannot dwell upon this question here, for the fragmentary character of the statistical data would require too detailed an analysis. It is sufficient for our purposes to cite Lange, who notes that, quote, an excessive bureaucratic apparatus has spread in all fields. This apparatus impedes the functioning of the economy and diverts an undue proportion of national income to unproductive use, end quote. Nevertheless, we may affirm the following. taking into account the fact that the incomes of Western capitalists are used in large part to finance investment, which is in bureaucratic countries financed by the, quote, state, end quote. The distribution of consumable income in these latter countries hardly seems less unequal than in the former. When, as frequently happens, a bureaucrat enjoys an income which includes both his official salary and the various perquisites, I don't know if it's a spelling error, perquisites, from which he benefits, 20, 30, or 50 times higher than the worker's average salary, we must conclude that this income is devoted exclusively to his consumption, and compare it not to a French or English capitalist's return on investment, but to the amount he consumes. The meaning of workers' critique. Stalinists in France and elsewhere try to explain the workers' revolt in Poland and in Hungary in terms of the absolute low standard of living, and this low living standard in turn is explained in terms of the poverty of these countries, their backwardness, the devastation of the war, etc. Here again, as in all their propaganda, Stalinists are more and more reduced to spouting absurdities. The working class is not revolting against the low standard of living as such, in the absolute, a notion that indeed hardly makes any sense at all. The working class is revolting against the stagnation of its living standards at the end of many years of inhuman labor. The working class is revolting against its misery compared to the luxury of bureaucratic parasites. It is revolting, last but not least, against the immense amount of wastefulness the bureaucracy creates in the factories and in the economy, against the fact that some half seconds of allotted time are being shaved off under the pretext of increasing production, while at the same moments millions of hours of social labor are purely and simply wiped out by the anarchy and incompetence of their brilliant bosses. This is clearly shown in the workers' protests in Hungary, which principally are directed against hierarchy and aimed at workers' management of the factories. The political evolution of, quote, de-Stalinization, end quote. The bureaucracy claims to be, quote, communist, end quote. The bureaucracy has organized the economy in a so-called socialist fashion. It has nationalized factories, it has subjected production to a, quote, plan, end quote. But the bureaucracy has changed nothing in the real situation of the workers. In production, the workers remain subject to the total power of the factory's managerial apparatus. In this managerial apparatus, the personnel alone have been changed, and not in every instance, but its spirit, its methods, and its role remain exactly the same as under private capitalism. To extract the greatest amount of labor possible from the workers by combining direct coercion, speed-ups, and production bonuses, and to deny the workers the least right to organize and to set the pace of their work. Just like the French, English, or American worker, the Polish, Czech, or Hungarian worker is transformed into a mere cog in the machine, into a soulless body who has nothing to say either about his own work or about that of his shop or factory. Without the right to strike, strikes are characterized as, quote, crimes against the socialist state, end quote. Without the right to form an organization to defend his interests, the official trade union organizations are merely a sub-branch of the factory's management whose essential function is to raise output, and consigned to arbitrary treatment in the hands of a foreman or the lowest party functionary, the worker has seen exploitation come crashing down on him as heavily as before, if not even more so. He has seen too, that his exploitation was serving the same ends as under private capitalism. On the one hand, he was exploited so that an ever greater number of new factories and machines could be built. On the other hand, His exploitation has enabled a stratum of parasites who no longer are his old bosses, but bureaucrats, factory managers, technicians, military people, intellectuals, leaders of the unions, the party, and the state, to enjoy a privileged existence. The proletariat has seen that this regime, which claimed to be, quote, communist, end quote, was simply another form of the capitalist system of rule in which the bureaucracy has taken the place of private employers. It has seen that, quote, nationalization, end quote, planning, end quote, have not changed its situation in the least. Totalitarian dictatorship has prevented it from organizing, from talking freely, from reading or hearing on the radio anything but official lies. But totalitarian dictatorship has not been and never will be able to prevent the workers from seeing the reality of the situation in which they live, which is their perpetual enslavement to a stratum of managers and rulers, who almost invariably squander their labor. All of production is organized toward extorting still more output out of them, and their misery contrasts with the luxurious lives of these parasites. Nor can it prevent them from resenting as the most infamous of affronts the speeches of these rulers, wherein all this is presented as, quote, socialism, end quote, and the, quote, reign of the working class, end quote. This totalitarian dictatorship cannot now and never will in the future be able to prevent the workers from struggling against exploitation by the means that always are at the disposal of the exploited. Their refusal to cooperate in production, which can be manifested in an infinite number of ways. Modern industry simply cannot function without a minimum of cooperation on the workers' part, without a display of their initiative and of their organizational capacities that surpasses by far what the workers are officially supposed to do, and that cannot be extorted from them through coercion. As far back as 1950, workers' resistance within the production process had attained such a degree of intensity that the economy of the satellite countries entered into a terrible crisis, whose depth can be measured only today. This crisis situation, let us repeat, is not peculiar to the satellite countries. It rages on in the USSR as well. But it is bound to be more grave where the bureaucracy is the youngest, where it has been implanted in the most artificial manner, and especially where it finds itself faced with a more mature working class. Having existed longer and having developed a higher class consciousness, the proletariat in the satellite countries allows things to happen only with much greater difficulty. It reacts more resolutely against exploitation. Under the Stalinist regime in Russia, despite the bureaucracy's lack of cohesion and its incompetence, there was no overt crisis from 1928 to 1941. Basically because the proletariat was constantly being diluted by the enormous flux of young peasants for whom entrance into the factories objectively and subjectively meant an important economic and social step forward. But since the war, tensions no doubt have been mounting in Russian factories too. Thus, as we have seen at the 20th Congress, the bureaucracy's leaders have been obliged to recognize that most of the time, in circumvention of all official rules, factory directors have been incapable of setting work norms, that these norms as well as the distribution of wages were in fact the result of compromise. After Stalin's death, the new team of rulers understood that for a long time to come it would be unable to rule in the old authoritarian way. It therefore tried to ward off a conflict by introducing a certain number of concessions. Here we have the meaning of, quote, de-Stalinization, end quote. This new team was driven to de-Stalinization by the situation in Russia, but it was driven to it just as much by the situation in the satellite countries. In particular, a key part was played by those satellite countries in which there was a relatively more mature proletariat. Having experienced capitalism, the working class in these countries did not confuse the construction of new factories with socialism. It knew that accumulating the instruments of production has always been the principal concern of the bosses, and it knew too that the Bulgarian or Romanian peasant, having been turned into a worker, is in the process of finding out, and this is also what the Chinese peasant will come to know in 15 or 20 years' time, namely that whatever the pace of progress in the production process, and whatever the miracles of, quote, socialist accumulation, end quote, his body and his mind are more and more being brought under the control of the infernal rhythms of the machinery. And it is precisely in these satellite countries where a working class experienced with capitalism had already existed that the workers' revolt against the bureaucracy exploded openly. In East Germany, when the workers rose up in June 1953, they battled with arms in hand against these so-called communist bureaucrats proclaimed, quote, "We are the true communists," and demanded a metal workers' government. And demanded a, quote, metal workers' government, end quote. Almost at the same time, strikes and working class riots broke out in Czechoslovakia. From then on, the Russian bureaucracy, along with the bureaucracies of the satellite countries, tried to, quote, soften, end quote, its course. Sensing that the home front was anything but secure, the bureaucracy sought rapprochement with the Western imperialists. It reached a tacit agreement with them on a halt to the arms race, and, limiting its military production, it tried to appease the workers with a few concessions on their standard of living. Then it tried to change its political face. It attempted to present Stalin as individually responsible for all the exploitation and all the crimes it had committed, stating that it was going to, quote, democratize, end quote, itself. We have the political meaning of the 20th Congress. And if it could deceive in this way a few disoriented intellectuals and a variety of washed-up political derelicts, it did not deceive the workers of the countries it dominated. For the workers, quote, democracy, end quote, has never signified and will never signify anything but this: the right to organize themselves as they want to be able to meet together, and to express themselves freely. For them, quite correctly, everything else is just empty talk. The bureaucratic countries were, and they still are, very far from that point. The real situation had not changed either from this standpoint or from the economic one. On the contrary, the workers sensed that the bureaucracy was not making concessions out of the goodness of its heart, that it had been frightened by the East Berlin revolt and the events in Czechoslovakia, and that the bureaucracy was handing out a few bribes only to the extent that the workers had battled with it openly and had tried to overthrow it. The lesson of 1953 had not been lost on the workers of Eastern Europe. Struggle alone pays, and a one-day revolt, even if it is beaten, does more to improve the workers' lot than 10 years of, quote, planning, end quote, and empty talk about, quote, joyful tomorrows, end quote. The workers correctly interpreted the bureaucracy's few, quote, concessions, end quote, and the declaration of the 20th Congress for what they were, a sign of tremendous weakness. From that time on, an extraordinary state of excitement and ferment seized hold of most of the satellite countries. Long contained within the factories, the working class's reaction now began to move out of doors. It was refracted into all social circles, and in particular among the young. It infiltrated into the base of the bureaucratic organizations, its parties and trade unions, and began to wear away at them. The bureaucracy quickly found itself incapable of mastering a revolt by an entire society. Through some spasmodic measures, rehabilitating former, quote, traitors, end quote, promising more freedom, pathetically recognizing its, quote, mistakes, end quote, changing its ruling personnel, and replacing them with bureaucrats who were capable of giving the impression that they were, quote, leftists, end quote, or, quote, oppositionists, end quote. It tried to appease the population and to show that something, quote, had really changed, end quote. Khrushchev's trip to Belgrade in June and Tito's to Yalta in October were attempts to demonstrate that Russia was now capable of recognizing the de facto, quote, independence, end quote, of the satellite countries. But it also expressed the growing anguish of Moscow's bureaucrats as well as those in Belgrade faced with a developing revolt. Both sets of bureaucrats felt it would be almost impossible to avoid the domestic repercussions of this revolt. The Polish Crisis and Gomulka. To no avail, in July at Poznan, the workers at the Stalin factory gave the signal for an open revolt against the regime. They defied the tanks, and some of which they soon afterwards took possession of, aided and abetted by some soldiers and some low-ranking army officers, and they tried to occupy government buildings. With their simple and profound slogans, quote, bread, quote, democracy, quote, freedom, quote, it's our revolution, quote, down with the big shots, end quote. They demonstrated both that, quote, de-Stalinization, end quote, had in reality changed nothing, and that the workers, having experienced bureaucracy, were perfectly capable of identifying the men in the system responsible for their being exploited. The Poznan revolt was defeated. Its repercussions in the country and in the other satellite countries, however, were enormous. The Polish, Russian, and Yugoslavian bureaucracies had the Polish, Russian, and Yugoslavian bureaucracies and the bare-faced liars from the French Communist Party daily, Humanité, tried to present it as an uprising of reactionary elements supported by the Americans. But no one in the satellite countries believed the bureaucracy's lies about the Poznan revolt. The attitude of the Yugoslavs, who systematically kept word of the Poznan trials secret, shows this clearly, if such proof was needed. On the contrary, all the visible signs and everything that could be inferred from the changes in the bureaucracy's attitude show that the Poznan revolt had given the signal for the workers to attack in several countries, and in the very first place, in Poland and in Hungary. From July to October, Poland lived in a state of extraordinary ferment. The masses began to take over the political stage. The Stalinist bureaucratic apparatus, which, with de-Stalinization, had already lost its internal cohesion and many crucial control posts, the political police, for example, turned against it, found itself utterly incapable of dominating the situation. Meeting after meeting contradicted the official slogans, expressed the workers' distrust of all the usual empty talk, and demanded real changes. The base of the bureaucratic apparatus, the rank-and-file, quote, militants, end quote, and petty cadres, lost all cohesion. Put under tremendous pressure by the working-class masses and seeing its entire ideology, which had kept it going for decades, crumbling away, rulers equal to brilliant and infallible chiefs, the opposition equal to treason, the party equal to the party of the working class, nationalization plus planning equals socialism, etc., it became sensitized to the working class protests. This pressure was transmitted into the bureaucratic apparatus, whose summits themselves in a state of decay, seized with fear, undecided as to which of several lines to follow, and no longer having the confidence of Moscow, where Khrushchev piled up gaffe upon gaffe, first with the July 20th resolution of the Central Committee of the CPSU, and ending with his surprise trip to Warsaw with 14 generals, floundered for 3 months before finding the, quote, solution, end quote, call back Gomulka, because he was at that time the sole possible cover, quote, on the left, end quote, an account of his opposition since 1949 to the dominant tendency. This, quote, Polish, end quote, clandestine chief of the Polish Communist Party since 1943, and thereby opposed to the Moscow émigrés who returned in 1945, and, quote, pro-Titoist, end quote, past, and his working-class origins. In recalling Gomulka to power, the Polish bureaucracy knew that it was going to run up against Moscow, which, full of impotent rage, saw the situation more and more escaping from its control. But it could do nothing else. The liquidation of the most compromised faction of the Stalinist leadership of the party, the state, and the economy was that the least it could do if it wanted to contain the mass movement, which was starting to take on extraordinary proportions. We now know that during the October 20th to 21st session of the Polish Party's Central Committee, during which Gomulka was recalled to power, the entire population, headed by workers and students, was on a war footing and ready to battle against a coup d'etat by the Stalinist fraction. The ferment reached its heights with the news of Khrushchev's arrival in Warsaw with his 14 generals. The workers remained in the factories ready to intervene in mass against an armed strike by the Russians and their tool, Marshal Rokossovsky. Sections of the army and the political police already were on a war footing. The Russians understood that under such conditions it was not a matter of simple, quote, police operation, end quote, still less of a, quote, coup d'etat, end quote, of one Polish fraction against another, and that they would have to undertake military operations on the scale of a real war. Thinking they could preserve at least a minimum of control over the situation in Poland through the intermediary of the party, which proved totally impossible 2 weeks later in Budapest, they effected what they no doubt thought was a tactical retreat. The present revolutionary situation in Poland and the contradictions of Gomulkism. Make sure I'm still recording here. I'm still recording. All right, good. While historically unprecedented, the present situation in Poland is no less clearly a revolutionary situation. The odious crimes of the previous regime are laid out in broad daylight. The exploitative and oppressive character of the bureaucracy that has been in power for 10 years has become a commonplace. Every attempt to return to an even remotely similar regime is completely out of the question, and bourgeois, quote, restorationist, end quote, tendencies are practically non-existent. Meetings of workers and students take place constantly, and no one can prevent them. No one can be stopped from saying what he thinks. Demand for changing the hierarchy of wages, for workers' management of the factories, and for democracy are being formulated and discussed all the time. On the other hand, we are still not witnessing the formation of mass Soviet organs, workers' councils, or similar kinds of committees. The transformation of the existing political and trade union organizations, however, is extremely profound. The character of the Communist Party, of the, quote, Polish United Workers' Party, end quote, has changed. Whatever survivals of the past there might be in places, Stalinist nuclei being able to survive in any kind of party organization, the remnants of the bureaucratic mentality nearly anywhere, the great majority of the Polish party's militants and middle-level cadres at present still take their stand on communist ground. Already the collapse of the regime and of Stalinist ideology, the practical understanding of its origins and its consequences, the opposition to Russian imperialism, the lesson of the Hungarian Revolution, and above all, the pressure and the demands of the Polish working class masses have completely transformed the mentality of these militants. The entrance of new working class elements into the party, who bring with themselves a proletarian mentality and proletarian demands, reinforces these factors to an extraordinary degree. These changes are not merely psychological. They are inscribed here and now in objective facts, which, while they certainly are not, quote, irreversible, end quote, could be challenged only through a long process of evolution and at the cost of creating new conflicts. For the first time since 1927, there is free discussion within a communist party. That's all in italics. Here we have an enormously important fact. Within the Polish party, people already are rejecting the stupid, quote, personality cult, end quote, theory, and the idea that, quote, mistakes, end quote, were made by Stalin or Beria. They are demanding that Stalinism, that is to say, bureaucratic capitalism, as, italics, total and coherent, a total and coherent system, end italics, as an economic, political, social, and ideological whole be analyzed. Some analyses are going in this direction which may be judged as timid from Paris, but which have the merit of actually existing and being made by people who have lived through the experience of the bureaucratic system, already are appearing in the Polish press. Some discussions are beginning to take place even about the Leninist conception of the party, and the criticisms of a certain Polish revolutionary, Rosa Luxemburg, was starting to formulate. Some discussions are beginning to take. I saw Rosa Luxemburg's name, so I got a boner and freaked out. Some discussions are beginning to take place even about the Leninist conception of the party, and the criticisms a certain Polish revolutionary, Rosa Luxemburg, was starting to formulate in 1918 against the dictatorship of the Central Committee over the party and of the party over the masses are being brought back out of the Stalinist dungeons. Under such conditions, no matter what the past and subjective intentions of the members of the party's leadership, of Gomulka, of Achab, or Achab, O-C-H-A-B, or Cyrankiewicz, Cyrankiewicz, it is obvious that they can rule only insofar as they move with this irresistible current. Similar transformations are taking place within the trade union movement. Since the days of the Warsaw October, the character of trade union organizations has changed. The bureaucratic apparatus, whose function under the Stalinist regime was to pressure the worker to produce, is in the process of being liquidated. The workers have invaded previously deserted trade union meetings. During the November Trade Union Congress in Warsaw, one can see 120 official delegates who theoretically made up the Congress pushed aside by 1,000 delegates spontaneously sent from the grassroots. They overturned the Congress's agenda and substance, forced the unions to open up their, quote, account books, end quote, in the fullest sense of this phrase, and transformed the Congress into a relentless indictment of the misdeeds of the trade union bureaucracy. The differences in the Polish and Hungarian situations are as important as their profound similarities are incontestable. Educated by the experience of bureaucratic capitalism, the mass movement in both cases exhibits an extraordinary strength. In Hungary, this strength is expressed by the destruction of all existing institutions and through open conflict with Russian imperialism. In Poland, it expresses itself in a thorough transformation of the character of the most important institutions, the party and the trade unions, and in the setback inflicted upon Russian imperialism. In Poland, therefore, the situation is entirely open, and the future of the Communist Party is equally so. At the same time, both the Polish Revolution and the policy of the Polish Party are caught in a series of objective contradictions. To shed light on these contradictions, to try to analyze them clearly, is the principal condition for being able to surmount them. On the other hand,
the Polish Revolution leads to the destruction of Russian imperialism's domination over the country, and at the same time it constitutes an open wound on the flanks of the bureaucratic world. Its power of contagion is tremendous. It already has given the signal to the Hungarian Revolution. Tribuna Luda copies are all sold out a few minutes after they arrive in Moscow, and the Russian bureaucracy cannot stop it from happening. But at the same time, the Polish Revolution cannot openly defy Russia. The Russian bureaucracy lies in wait for the Polish Revolution, ready to strangle it one way or another at the first opportunity. Under such conditions, the leadership of the Polish Party is obliged to come to terms with the Kremlin. The Russo-Polish Accord signed during Gomulka's latest trip to Moscow offers, like all compromises, positive and negative sides. In signing the accord, the Russian bureaucracy makes it much more difficult for it to intervene later on. It has been obliged to recognize that it has exploited Poland from 1945 to 1953. It has renounced further exploitation and now pledges to furnish economic aid. On the other hand, Gomulka is obliged to accept the situation of Russian troops in Poland, which contains dangers for the future, and he signed a statement approving, in fact, although indirectly, the Russians' crushing of the Hungarian Revolution. The accord does not speak of Russian intervention or of Kadar, but of the Polish and Russian government's support, quote, for the workers' and peasants' government of Hungary, end quote. Here we already have a concession on principles, which one day or another can be turned back against Poland itself. The goal of all compromises is to gain time. Under present circumstances, the Polish government has to gain some time. On the one hand, because the crisis of the bureaucracy makes the Polish Revolution here and now the order of the day in Russia and in other places, and in any case limits the Kremlin's opportunities for intervention. And on the other hand, because it needs to be able to carry on, expand, and deepen in Poland itself. And it is especially from this last standpoint that the compromise reached with the Russian bureaucracy will take on its ultimate significance. It will have been positive if it permits the development of the revolution in the country. The development of the revolution within Poland itself encounters contradictions that are just as profound as those found in the area of foreign relations. The economic situation bequeathed by the Stalinist regime is very chaotic. Coordination of various sectors of production has to start over again from scratch. After 10 years of forced collectivization and plundering the peasantry through ground rent levies, it will be tremendously difficult to integrate the peasantry into the appropriate economic channels. On the political plane, and more profoundly on the plane of the organization of social life in all its aspects, mass organs do not exist, although, as we have seen, the character of the Communist Party has experienced profound transformations. The Stalinist bureaucracy is continually being eliminated from the top post in the economy and in the state. But a, quote, purged, end quote, leadership apparatus continues to manage the economy. The state apparatus has changed personnel, but not its objective character. It remains a separate apparatus made up of permanent and, in principle, irremovable bureaucracy. Made up of a permanent and, in principle, irremovable bureaucracy. We must stop here and try to deepen our examination of these contradictions, starting with the problem that is the most basic and that thereby escapes the notice of those who talk today on and on at the periphery of the Polish Revolution. This is the problem of workers' management of the economy. Workers' management of production is the obvious, indisputable, conscious, and explicit conclusion Eastern Europe workers are drawing from the experience of bureaucratic capitalism. Obviously, none of them have thought for an instant of bringing back private employers. But neither can one have confidence now in any sort of ruling bureaucracy, even a, quote, democratic, end quote, or, quote, revolutionary, end quote, bureaucracy. For years, we have been exposing this bureaucracy for what it is, using documents, statistics, and arguments. But the Hungarian or Polish worker has had intimate first-hand experience of it. His experience is not only as an exploiting stratum, he experiences it not only as an exploiting stratum, italics, but as a stratum that is incapable of managing production, end italics. It is the bureaucratic management of the economy that has gone bankrupt in the Eastern European proletariat's eyes. Insofar as it takes action, this proletariat, therefore, is driven inevitably to the following conclusion: the only remaining solution is the organization of production by the producers themselves. The Polish Workers' Party recognizes this situation and the corresponding demands of the workers. It hesitates, nevertheless, and it proposes to instaurate as a, quote, experimental, end quote, measure, a kind of workers' management in certain factories, but there can be no question of mere experimentation. In the Polish situation, workers' management is the sole possibility for starting up the economy and production again quickly. Otherwise, at the end of a period of chaos, it will be necessary to return under one form or another to a bureaucratic system, pure and simple. Neither can it be a question of limiting management to a few factories, nor of limiting it to the factories, thus leaving the functions of coordination and management of the economy as a whole to a bureaucratic apparatus. On the one hand, if workers' management is effective within particular factories and not a mystification, like Tito's, quote, co-management, end quote, the workers will abolish hierarchy and work norms. Discipline concerning matters relating to production will be established by the workers themselves and will be that much more effective. But that cannot happen in each individual factory without any coordination without any coordination with the other factories. For all rationalization of the production process as a whole will become impossible. Once, quote, competition, end quote, and the capitalist, quote, market, end quote, are abolished, this rationalization effort presupposes that all the individual units of production are regulated in some overall fashion. There are only two ways of establishing this overall regulation: either by abstract and impersonal production norms that must be defined and imposed from outside, and this is the function of a separate bureaucratic apparatus, or by assemblies of representatives from the workers' councils of each enterprise, which, branch by industrial branch, will try to standardize and rationalize the methods and pace of production in a vital way while taking into account the concrete conditions of each enterprise. On the other hand, the workers' council managing a particular factory is obliged to attend to the rest of the economy. In stocking of machines and raw materials, in its disposal of the goods produced dependent upon it, its stocking of machines and raw materials and its disposal of the goods produced. Just killed a mosquito. Fuck yeah, badass. It will distribute wages, whose buying power depends on what happens everywhere else in the economy, and in particular in the agricultural sector. The problem of the centralized direction of the economy is thus posed in all its acuity. It too can be resolved in two ways. Either workers' councils will be formed, will federate with each other on the national level, will include representatives from village or district peasants' councils, and will take on the whole set of tasks involved in directing the economy, including the functions of, quote, planning, end quote. All of this being the sole route leading towards socialism. Or else the task of central direction will remain in the hands of a bureaucracy separate from the producers, in which case a reversal of the process will in the end be inevitable, and workers' management in individual factories itself will lose its meaning and will be transformed into a means of riveting the workers to a production process over which they will again have no power. For the moment, the Polish Party has a hesitant and contradictory attitude toward this question. On the one hand, it states that its ultimate objective is workers' management. On the other, it hesitates to commit itself to this route. The economic program adopted in July by the 7th plenum of its Central Committee, and whose main features are found in the article by Oscar Lange that we have cited several times, was nothing more than a program for cleaning up the bureaucratic economy and putting the bureaucratic economy in order. This program was intended to overcome the crisis in production, the famous, quote, nihilism, end quote, of the workers, by reintroducing typically capitalist procedures like, quote, material incentives, and, quote, economic stimulants, end quote. In other words, by piecework. It was intended to overcome the anarchy of planning by rationalizing the hierarchy. From now on, this hierarchy should be based upon, quote, economic efficiency, end quote, rather than on, quote, clans and political intrigues, end quote. In this context, the call for, quote, considerably enlarging the workers' participation in the direction of enterprises, end quote, has lost all objective meaning. Every exploitative regime is all for this today, since the bankruptcy of the bureaucratic method of directing production has become evident, even to the exploiters themselves. The reports of the 20th Congress of the Russian Party are filled with calls to factory managers aimed at, quote, making the workers associates in the operation of the enterprises, end quote. In the West, capitalism in its turn tries to persuade the workers to let it know their opinions about how to produce. But all these efforts run aground, for the workers know that they have no say over management decisions, and that the managers will eventually use their collaboration to integrate them even further into the production process, and to exploit them even more. Likewise, quote, economic stimulants, end quote, fail when they encounter the growing resistance workers exhibit toward piecework and toward wage differentiations. The program of the 7th plenum is outstripped by the reality of the situation, though the official program of the Polish Party remains in place. It is clear, however, that the root of, quote, economic stimulants, end quote, of piecework, of norms set by a bureaucracy separated from the production process, sooner or later becomes the road back to economic domination by the bureaucracy. The same contradictions are found again on the, quote, political, end quote, level, which is in reality the plane of overall social life. The party has changed its character, but it remains de facto and de jure the supreme instance of power. Whatever its character, can a party lead society to socialism, or does not this passage to socialism imply rather that the masses, organized in councils or in other Soviet-style organs, must take their fate into their own hands? Can the directorship of the proletariat be can the dictatorship of the proletariat be the dictatorship of a party? These are neither theoretical questions nor sectarian subtleties. They are the supreme questions of our age, and the fate of the Polish Revolution depends in the most practical and immediate way on the response to them. We think the entire experience of the last 40 years and the analysis of the current situation allow us to respond in the most categorical fashion to this question. Working class power can be nothing other than the power of working class power can be nothing other than the power of mass working class organs. Sorry, I just killed another mosquito, but I caught it like in the air, like smacked it together like the monkeys with the tambourines. Not the tambourines, the cymbals clashing together. It was badass. You should have seen it. I should start making videos. Me just killing mosquitoes. The dictatorship of the proletariat is not the dictatorship of the party, of a party, but rather the power of workers' councils that realizes at the same time the greatest amount of proletarian democracy. Either the party, the state apparatus, and the apparatus for directing the economy will wither away as they are reabsorbed into mass organs that will take on managerial functions on all levels, or else they will separate themselves off from the masses, reduce them to silence, and develop according to their own logic toward a totalitarian bureaucracy, whatever form it may take. The power of the party's role in the dictatorship of the proletariat is the problem of italics, reunification of social life that is indispensable for the realization of socialism, end italics. What is happening at this moment in Poland? What runs the risk of happening in a much more clear-cut fashion tomorrow? On the one side there is the real life of people, in production and elsewhere. On the other side, there is an apparatus running the economy that to run things effectively should be made up of representatives of the producers, and which in fact is not. In the third place, there is a state apparatus that is itself also separated from those whom it has to administer. And heading it all up, there is the party, which is trying one way or another to coordinate all this. This last entity is a living contradiction. For either it actually is coordinating things, in which case it is the sole instance of power and all the rest is merely smoke and mirrors, or else it is not coordinating things, and then it is superfluous as a governmental organ, and not, of course, as a, quote, political, end quote, ideological, end quote, group. In other words, either the real social life of society in all its aspects will become identical with a single network of institutions, or else the traditional institutions, party, state, the management of the economy and of the factories, separated from the mass of people and thereby from their real life as well, will rise up anew above society and having become again the incarnation of a particular social category, will dominate it. From this viewpoint, which ultimately is the most important one, the Polish situation contains very serious negative elements. First of all, the movement of the masses has not culminated till now in the formation of councils. The party has channeled this movement not only, quote, ideologically and, quote, politically, but also organizationally. We do not know to what extent it has helped to prevent the formation of councils, which would prove at any rate that it was possible to prevent their formation. Besides, there can be no question of the party creating councils by decree. What is clear is that the spontaneous mass movement has remained till now on the near side of constituting organs of power. By its ambiguity, however, the party's very attitude contains a host of dangers. The party finds itself in a situation that is unique in history. Most of its members have just made great strides in the space of a few months. Its structures have been regenerated, and its ties with the workers are being reinforced. Beyond it, however, no organs representative of the working class exist. In such a situation, it can try to contribute with all the means at its disposal to the development of the mass movement. Or it can fall back on itself, thinking that the achievement of socialism is its own business and that it will find in itself all the solutions it needs. We must not hide the fact that a host of indications show that the party inclines dangerously toward the second solution. When Gomulka said, quote, "The process of democratization can only be directed by the United Workers' Party," end quote, this not only was a contradiction in terms, i.e. a democratization effort led by a de facto unique party, it expressed at the same time the party's will to maintain for itself a monopoly on power, and thereby it also compromises the chances for developing the mass movement. When the party remains up in the air on the crucial question of workers' management, the party reinforces the chances for the process of bureaucratization to begin anew. However great the amount of democracy there is within the party, when the constitution of working-class political organizations is still prohibited, the proletariat's possibilities for controlling the situation remain dangerously limited. No one can give lessons to the Polish Revolution, and one would have to be blind not to see the tremendous difficulties facing the Polish communists, capital C communists, and the courage they exhibit in attacking those difficulties. These problems are being discussed intensely in Poland at the present hour, and the revolutionary movement in other countries has the right and the duty to know both the strength of the Polish Revolution and the foreign and domestic dangers lying in wait for it. The future of the Hungarian Revolution. After the Second Russian intervention and the constitution of Kadar's puppet government, the true proletarian and socialist character of the Hungarian Revolution was manifested with still more clarity than before. As was said, the shopkeepers left their stores during the second week of the insurrection. They went back inside for good after the third week. Apart from the Russian tanks, the sole real power existing in the country, the force of workers organized in their councils, hung in there, organized the general strike, and kept up its demands when it did not actually deepen them. The demands posed by the councils to Kadar at various times since November 11 include workers' management of the factories, although Kadar already had, quote, decreed, end quote, it. The constitution of workers' councils in all branches, including state administrative offices. The right of the councils to publish their own newspapers. The withdrawal of the Russian troops. The constitution of working-class militias. The recognition of the councils as organs representative of the working class. The recognition of the political role of the councils, and the return of Imre Nagy, I think that's how you pronounce his name, IMRE space NAGY, to power, and hence the resignation of the current government. The import of these demands does not need to be analyzed. We should emphasize simply that in posing them at the moment when everything in the country seemed to be bowing before the Russian terror, and in presenting some of them rather than others according to the tactical situation of the moment, the council showed their ability to take the viewpoint of the population as a whole, and thereby also their capacity to be the sole leadership of the society. From its first day, people have been in a hurry to bury the Hungarian Revolution. We are writing these lines on the 9th of December, 1956, and this revolution, which has lasted 48 days, is as alive as ever. Despite deportations and nocturnal arrests of council members, these members do not give up their resistance. Should the more or less open struggle cease for a while, that would provide no more of a solution for the Russians or for Kadar. Henceforth, the Hungarian regime is considered by the whole population as temporary, for the same reason that the Nazi occupation was considered so during the war.
and this determines people's attitude toward Khadr as well as his inability to reestablish a state machine functioning at a satisfactory level. The Russians are faced with an insoluble dilemma. To leave is to admit a tremendous defeat and to show to all the peoples they oppress that they need only fight with sufficient determination to win. It also is to open the way to proletarian revolution and socialism in Hungary, and to the irresistible appeal its example would furnish to other countries in the East. To remain is not only to maintain in this country a chaotic situation leading nowhere, in the final analysis, it is to import the revolution into Russia. For the Russian soldiers stationed in Hungary are becoming increasingly contaminated by what is going on there, and through them these events contaminate a steadily growing segment of the Russian population. And this is happening at the moment when the manifestations of the crisis in Russia's own regime are growing. When Khrushchev acknowledges that the attitude of Russian youth to the regime does not differ much from the attitude of Hungarian youth, when more and more severe warnings are addressed to intellectuals who do not understand the limits to their role as the bureaucracy's entertainers, and when, added to these unmistakable signs of the approaching storm, there are subterranean rumblings of working-class anger that no longer can be stifled, of a proletariat that numbers 40 million individuals and that thinks, as the official organ of the Russian trade unions is compelled to write, that, quote, our administration is only a bureaucracy, our trade unions only assemblies of functionaries, end quote. The proletarian revolution against the bureaucracy is only just beginning. For the first time since the Spanish Revolution of 1936, the working class is creating anew in Hungary its own autonomous mass organs. From its first day, this revolution has taken place at a higher level than previous revolutions. The bureaucratic regime is being combated from the outside by workers it fraudulently claims to represent. In the name of the genuine and true socialism it so long has prostituted. The hold of bureaucratic organizations over the workers' movement in Western capitalist countries will never recover from the blow it just has suffered. Our first and foremost task today is to propagate the program of the Hungarian Revolution, to help the French proletariat in its struggle against its own bureaucracy, a struggle that is indissociable from its own struggle against capitalist exploitation. It is also to work for an all-round regrouping of the workers and the militants who recognize in the Hungarian workers' struggle and program their struggle and their program. The end.